What was it like to lead the Defense Innovation Unit, DIU? How has DIU transformed the way the U.S. Department of Defense fields commercial technology? And what does the future hold for innovation at DoD? Today, I welcome back to the show Mike Brown, former director of the Defense Innovation Unit, to explore these questions and much more. So, Mike, as you reflect on your time at DIU, what were your key strategic objectives on the first day you took over? And how significantly did these objectives evolve, morph, or get overtaken by events or the realities of the bureaucracy that you had to deal with?
Well, I think the strategic objectives remained consistent. One of the things that my team had told me coming into the job at DIU is we needed contracting capacity. So if you think about bringing technology into the military, it's got to start with some way of evaluating that technology and testing it in a military application. And we did that through contracting a prototyping process. And contracting means we've got to get vendors on contract to see how they do. So before my time, we were working exclusively with some other parties within the Defense Department where we were not a priority, in fact, had very small contracts relative to what they were doing. So it was very important for us to develop our own contracting capacity. And my first day on the job was sitting with the Undersecretary for Acquisition and Sustainment, Ellen Lord at the time, asking her for delegated contracting authority so that we could go out and hire a small team that is responsible today for about 2/3 of our contracting. We still work with some outside parties outside to DIU to supplement that. But today, the primary way we're contracting with vendors is through DIU's own contracting capacity. The strategic objectives, so I mentioned one, contracting, were really to make sure that we started to scale DIU. So we already had proven some early successes. DIU's, as an example, responsible for Kessel Run, if you've heard about that, the software factory that the Air Force developed. That started out as a DIU project. We already had some early wins. We needed to scale that. We needed to make sure that we had the process and the talent to make sure that we could do that on a much broader scale, many more projects. And I feel like we got there. By the time I left, we were doing 100 projects simultaneously. We'd introduced 100 new vendors. We brought 50 capabilities over the line from testing them out to putting them in warfighters' hands. That really was the key mission for us.
That's wonderful, Mike. So, I want to stay on this because our first interview we did, I was very intrigued by your fast follower strategy. And I was hoping you could revisit that, Mike, for us. And how's the strategy and approach resonated within the department in general?
Okay, well, let's talk about what it is. The fast follower strategy is really taking a note from the private sector and saying, as many technology companies want to be out first with technology, and that's the strategy of many companies that I've worked with in the past. Not everyone can be first. If you're not first, you're trying to fast follow or as quickly as possible get current with technology. In the department, what I observed is that if we weren't inventing the technology, then often we were a slow follower. So it took us a long time. In fact, it takes the department 9 to 26 years on average to bring a new capability into the department. If you're developing the technology, I think we can go faster, but there's some natural limitations to how fast you can go. If you're merely buying technology that already exists, like AI, software, cyber tools, autonomous capability through small drones, you don't want to be taking a decade to bring that capability in. So what we needed is an alternative way to evaluate and procure that technology. That alternative, we call the DIU the fast follower strategy. We need to fast follow what the commercial world is doing. And the department needs an alternative way, a fast follower strategy, to bring that capability in. And it really revolves around a couple of things. One, we got to understand what part of the department should be responsible for those technologies. In other words, these technologies like AI or cyber are not developed for a particular branch of the service, Navy, Air Force, which is the way we bring in our new capabilities. But we got to figure out who's responsible for bringing that capability in, like commercial satellite imagery to support the conflict in Ukraine. We've got to know, is that the NRO, the NGA, is that Space Force, Air Force? The person responsible then can establish the group that's going to evaluate that technology and, most importantly, the budget that will provide that ongoing capability. And with that, and if we think about this as we've got to be not developing, but evaluating technology and quickly on a schedule that the commercial market provides it, we've got to be thinking about a very fast cycle time to evaluate and field that technology. That's a very different motion than the department has for most of what it brings in, developing a new tank or next generation fighter for the Air Force. So that new motion will help us bring in more vendors. So we diversify the supply base, keep the warfighter current with technology rather than dealing with technology that might be a decade old, and better value for our taxpayers because we're using commercial technology instead of something we're developing in a bespoke fashion just for the military. So we're leveraging that much larger consumer or business base that commercial vendors are going after. So that's a win-win for vendors, for our warfighters, and for the Department of Defense. So our view is we need to be adopting this as quickly as possible. You asked how it's resonated. I think things take time within the Defense Department, so I think it is resonating, but we're yet to implement this on a broad scale.
That's fascinating. So, Mike, you point out that clearly there's a need for long-term research that places like DARPA does. But I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, that it takes on average about, 9 to 26 years for the department to bring new capability online. While you folks when you were at DIU were leveraging commercial technology and could bring that in 1 or 2 years. I was wondering, how does the department balance between capabilities that can be deployed near term versus DoD's average time frame to do it? How do you balance that act?
Well, your question really foretells what the department needs to do. We're not doing a very good job of balancing that, to be honest with you, because this is rooted in the department's history of developing its own technology. And of course, if you're developing your own technology and you're the first customer, it takes a little bit longer to make sure that that technology is ready for prime time, ready to be deployed. Commercial technology, we just need to evaluate that in a military application and get it to the field. That can be a much faster process. Again, 1 to 2 years instead of 1 to 2 decades. But I don't think we have a very good sense within the department of how much more we could be doing with commercial technology and therefore deploying it on a broad scale and deploying it rapidly. So this is one of the key opportunities I saw in my time at DoD is we need to better balance what can be brought in 1 to 2 years and what we're not developing with the capability that we are developing. I'm a huge fan of DARPA. That's led to some incredible innovations that, frankly, Silicon Valley and other innovation hubs are still building on. If you think about the combination of GPS technology, the internet, miniaturized electronics, entire industries have been built on the combination of those technologies, all started with defense investment. But as we think about what the department needs going forward to modernize faster, many more of those technologies, as I've already mentioned, are going to come from the commercial world, not just from something we invent at the Defense Department. Therefore, we need this different process, a fast follower strategy to bring it in. And we need more of a focus on, are we balancing what can be brought in 1 to 2 years? More investment in bringing in those capabilities in 1 to 2 years. If you spend time, as I have, with Admiral Aquilino, who leads our Indo-Pacific Combatant Command. So he's responsible for all of our military, Air Force, Navy, Army, Marines, Space Force, from the Pacific coast of the U.S. all the way to India. This is just a vast region. And he will tell you, I'm interested in what I can deliver to my team, my warfighters in 1 to 2 years. Don't tell me about something that's going to be available in a decade. Because his time frame is, I've got to be ready to fight whenever I'm called upon to do so. And I can't say I'll come help out in a decade. I might have to do that on a very rapid time frame. So it just underscores the need for the department to better balance what can we do to shore up our capabilities in a short time period and balance that with what we're doing from a long-term investment standpoint.
Mike, earlier you described for us the first follower strategy you pursued at DIU. I was wondering, could you tell us more about the hedge strategy and how it was developed, why it was developed? How does it complement first follower? And how does it seek to generate a sense of urgency for emerging technology adoption?
Right. Well, we talked about the fast follower strategy before, and these two are complementary. This kind of is looking a step earlier. How do we identify what we need? So fast follower is if we know what we need, small drones, commercial satellite imagery, how do we make sure that we've got a way to assess and procure that technology? This is really looking upstream. How do we know what we need? Well, we have fielded many of the same large platforms, aircraft carriers, F-35s for years, and our adversaries have been watching what we're fielding. In some cases, they copied it. The Chinese have stolen designs for our fighter aircraft, as an example. And they also see how do we take the gear that we have and use that in the field, what we might call operations or CONOPS. How do we go to war? How do we fight? So that's also very much studied by our adversaries. Unfortunately, because we've been so active on the world stage with conflicts, whether it's been in Syria or elsewhere, our adversaries have seen us in action. So that gives them a blueprint, a way to study what they might do to fight against us. We need an element of surprise there. We need to be using more commercial technology to be able to field capabilities in 1 to 2 years, as we talked about before. And that creates a hedge against the very large platforms. So this isn't a substitution. We need those large platforms, but we need to complement those with more capabilities that bring in smaller capabilities, unmanned, low cost. Resilience comes, therefore, if we're in a conflict with a more capable adversary, they're going to shoot down some of the capability that we have. So we need capabilities resilient that can go on and continue to take the fight forward if some of the capability is lost. So this concept of bringing things that are small, unmanned, mini for resiliency and low cost is an incredible complement to the defense capability that we field today. That's the hedge strategy. How do we hedge those large platforms? We bring new capability, we bring it faster, and it brings an element of strategic surprise. And if we can agree on what those things are, then the fast follower strategy becomes the great complement, how we can bring those into the department. And I think the combination of those two would make us a much more modern force, much more capable, much more ready to fight tonight if that's what we're called upon to do.
You know, on some level, DIU is facing what appears to be a shortage of funding and insufficient support, maybe from senior Defense Department leaders, as well as issues regarding the budget process. I was wondering if you concur with these issues that I've just raised, and if so, what can be done to address them?
So I absolutely concur. I think this is a function not of the department saying what DIU is doing is not that important, but the fact that it takes us so long to develop a budget at the Department of Defense. It takes 2.5 years from the time we start the planning on how we're going to spend money before that money is approved and we can start spending. 2.5 years. Imagine in the corporate world, if we said we're going to have to start 2.5 years before the fiscal year starts with our planning process, and frankly, get that approved a year before the spending starts by the board of directors, and then we can't change it. It's a crazy system and it needs to be reformed. Congress has recognized that. And in this year's National Defense Authorization Act, they funded a commission called the PPB&E, which stands for Planning, Programming, Budgeting, and Execution. Basically, think about that as a budgeting process. So how do we reform that? What changes should we make? So I'm optimistic that that PPB&E commission, which in itself is a 2-year time frame for them to do their work, I'm optimistic they're going to come up with some good ideas that will help us improve that. But I think we could all agree that 2.5 years as a process for the budget for the Defense Department is not competitive if we're competing against a country like China. We have to be able to move faster. That may have been sufficient when we won the Cold War and we had a generation where we didn't have a peer adversary, but it's certainly not competitive for the future. So this means that the budget that the Defense Department is working on, and then we eventually get approved by Congress, tends to lag the support we've already gotten from Congress. So to put that in specific terms, we got a record level of budget approved in fiscal year 21. So that was last year's budget. But the 22 budget, which was already being worked at the Office of Management and Budget and on its way to the Hill, the department had already finished its work on that, implied about a 30% budget cut for DIU. Again, not because someone said, let's take DIU down 30%. That was reflecting where DIU's budget was 3 years ago. So this has created a resourcing problem for DIU. We've worked hard to expand our capability. I mentioned the scaling was our primary challenge when I came to lead DIU, and now we've expanded to working on 100 projects simultaneously. We need some increase in the budget, or at least keeping that flat, to be able to continue that momentum. And so it's very hard to deal with a 30% budget decline when you have that expanding demand for what we do. We've never had more demand from our mission partners, Navy, Air Force, Army, Marines, Space Force, than what we have today. More and more people have heard about what we're doing. They want to take advantage of our capability and bring in more commercial technology. That's exactly what we want. But the budgeting process taking so long has not really kept pace with that. So that's what we're trying to do, is give a little bit of visibility to that and get some help from the department as they think about future budgets, because we're now working on the fiscal year 24 budget within the department, and some help from our wide number of supporters in Congress who would like to see us expand what we're doing.
That's terrific. Mike, you mentioned throughout our conversation our adversaries, near-peer adversaries, including China. And you were one of the first to sound the alarm about Chinese venture capital, which you referenced earlier. I was wondering if you could revisit this question for me and tell me what more is being done to address it, to mitigate it, and maybe tackle the influence of adversarial capital.
So fortunately, there's a lot that's being done here. So one of the pieces of legislation that I was able to work on and support was the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act that we talked about. So that gave CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S., which has the jurisdiction to review any transactions where a foreign company wants to buy U.S. assets that could be important for national security. It gave them more authority, which they're using now, to be able to scrutinize many more things beyond outright acquisitions. So it's possible for a foreign company to come in, make an investment, and have a controlling interest. Previously, that was not part of what CFIUS was able to look at. Now they're able to look at transactions like that, transactions that would result in any transfer of intellectual property from the U.S. to an adversary like China. So FIRMA is one part of it. At the same time, export control was reformed through the Export Control Reform Act of 2018. And while there hasn't been as much done with that in the subsequent years, now there's a big push by the administration to take advantage of that. And you might have seen that recently in the work that's being done to look at limiting Chinese access to semiconductor capability, design, manufacturing, test capability, which is primarily owned by U.S. vendors. There's also, I would say, a tremendous growth in the number of sources of capital focused on defense tech or dual use, which means technology can be used both for defense as well as commercial technology. So in these areas of AI, cyber tools, autonomy, space, there's a lot more venture capital, private capital available to those companies as the need for that has been highlighted. So I'm pleased to say that not only are we implementing some of the sticks, but we also have the carrots of more capital being focused in this area. The more we can make DIU successful in terms of ensuring that the military is actually buying more of this technology, then we create that virtuous circle I talked about before. So the good news is there's a tremendous awareness of the problem between what's been done with some of the new legislation and the government using its existing authority, like the sanctions authority, creating these entity lists of what technology, what companies we shouldn't be selling to because they're actually supporting the PLA or the Chinese armed forces. That's created a lot of visibility for this problem. Good example there, Hikvision, the primary supplier of the facial recognition that's being used for, population control, especially in the Uyghur population out in Xinjiang. So companies like that are helping the PLA and helping the Chinese with very repressive technologies are ones that that are being highlighted here, and the government's finding a way where we're not supporting those technologies going forward. And some of that's come through the legislation that we talked about, exercising the new authorities. And then we've got U.S. capital now that's able to take some of the place of what before was adversarial capital funding these U.S. high technology ventures.
I was wondering, Mike, what will you remember most about your government service? What are you most proud of?
Well, clearly it'd be helping warfighters. I had a chance to see so many of the missions within the Department of Defense, which, we often don't reflect on how broad those are. Many of them are humanitarian assistance, disaster recovery missions, and DIU directly supported a number of projects there. First responders after hurricanes, California wildfires, natural disasters around the world. So our military is first on the ground in those situations. Our military was critical to the vaccine development and distributing those vaccines to respond to COVID. So being able to support warfighters in what they're doing, which, as I just mentioned, often isn't fighting war, but being out on the front lines to help not only American people, but people around the world. And the chance to work with so many of the really dedicated folks in our military was a real privilege. The military really trains a phenomenal cadre of dedicated people. And I was very proud to help them, and it was an honor to be able to work with them directly. People would often say to me, "Thank you for your service," but my service or sacrifice pales in comparison to those who actually had to be deployed overseas, put themselves into harm's way, so that we can enjoy the great life that we do in the United States with so many freedoms. So that's what I'm going to remember about my time.
This has been a special edition of the Business of Government Hour, Reflections on Public Service with Mike Brown, former director of the Defense Innovation Unit. Be sure to join us next time for another informative, insightful, and in-depth conversation on improving government leadership and its effectiveness. Until then, subscribe, download, and listen to the entire interview at Podcast One, iTunes, or on your favorite podcast app, and as always at businessofgovernment.org.